I can't think of a time where every major institution is being challenged at the same time. We're questioning our government, religion, healthcare, marriage is totally being rewritten. And that to me is exciting, but it also says we're ready for a reset.
It's a society that is collapsing. We do seem to be seeing that split of I will survive in hard conditions versus I don't know what I'm doing and I'm simply losing my mind.
40% of Americans are anticipating a civil war. Why that's happening?
There's so much separation. Humans have not really been able to live in such tiny, isolated little pockets before. To have a little cubicle home in a little apartment building with DoorDash, you never have to experience another human ever again if you don't want to.
I will say this is not the first time in human history or even American history that we have been here. We have created a much better world for ourselves. I would challenge anyone to just go ahead and point to a time where you think it was better to be alive.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to I Wish You Knew. Are you wondering what's wrong with Gen Zers and why is it that they can't handle conflict? Or maybe what's going to be happening to us all as a society in the next 10, 20 years? Well, we have a fantastic guest on today. Sebastian Angus is a motivational coach. He is a consultant. He's been running businesses for a very long time, building sales teams and processes and organizations up to success. He's also been studying the marketplace from the perspective of companies like AT&T, Amazon, and many other big giants. So he has insights that we simply do not. And he's here to join us today. This is going to be a fantastic conversation. We're not just touching on Gen Zers and what's going to be happening with the world, but also talking about the nature of conflict and why conflict is so important and how we can handle it in a way that's going to be productive as opposed to destructive. Adam, what are you excited for in this conversation?
I would like to get into and explore how conflict is being shaped across multiple generations and how not engaging in those conflicts in the best way is leading to a rise in attachment challenges and thereby shaping society.
Fantastic. All right, guys, let's welcome Sebastian and let's get right into it.
Sebastian, I'm excited today to talk about how to have great conflict in the modern world. Could you tell our audience to get started, what do you wish they knew about you?
Just like everyone else, I'm a spirit and a body having a human experience, trying to point the way towards hopefully capital T truth, but probably focused more on lowercase truths in that process.
Now, do you find that we discover truth by avoiding conflict, or do you think we discover truth by having conflict?
Well, in general, I would say we find truth through seeking those areas in which we are uncomfortable to look, which generally means finding ourselves either in a conflict with ourselves, the other, or nature.
I love this. Let's break this down a little bit. Talk to us about conflict with self. And for context here, many of the people at home, hello people, many of the people at home are struggling with attachment issues. They've come in through my work for that regard. Or they just have grown up with a low self-esteem. They don't understand who they are, maybe, or they've battled against their own self-image for a long time. I think most people in America are in conflict with themselves right now at this time. So talk to the people at home a little bit. What does conflict with self look like so that they can self-diagnose that?
Yeah, so to create some frame around that, I would say we are a spirit, and I'll illustrate this in a second, having a human experience. Our spirit creates the world, our mind manifests the world, and our body experiences the world. So we could test this by challenging the idea that we don't see the world the way it is. We do not see an objective world. We see a highly subjective world, meaning we see the world the way we are. Our perception is our reality. There is not much of an objective world. As much as my left-minded scientists would like to believe that, they're coming to the ends of their ability to explain the world and understanding that this is much more of a subjective world than an objective world. That doesn't mean that there aren't physical laws that we can't seem to bend or break, but our perception creates our reality. This is important when we start talking about internal conflict, because the strongest driver psychologically for human is the need to be congruent with how we see ourselves, meaning our story of self, identity. And so this is the work, and within that work and that story within ourselves, we generate an insane amount of conflict when our internal world is challenged by our external experience, or we have conflicting values. So going back to this framework, we are a spirit that is creating our world. Our mind gets to manifest our world, and our body gets to experience that manifestation, is where so much of the juice is. But so much of that is experienced in conflict until we begin to integrate these truths, or we could say, remember what we have forgotten. And the deeper truths, I would say the capital T truths, tend to bear witness more than a aha. In other words, it's like we remember what we have forgotten. It's like, oh yeah, that's right. And so the first big boss battle is internal conflict. And there's an old African proverb that I agree with that says, if there is no enemy within, no enemy without can hurt you. And that's very true in my experience. If we are an integrated being, we collapse all three into integration, the world makes a hell of a lot more sense because we make a lot of sense. We make a lot more sense to ourselves. But in early life, the battle very often is between head and heart, right? And what we feel and what we know. And being able to become a conscious creator in this life is the integration of those two, head and heart. And you can hear it when somebody speaks from a truth that is integrated. It's a much different relay of information than somebody that is speaking in the theoretical. And so then in between, especially when we're younger, we have a lot of theoretical knowledge that doesn't always line up with our experiences in the world. Where if our story is tied to theoretical knowledge, it inherently will cause lots of conflict internally. And then we will either choose to override our stories or we will accept what we see. And because we're so deeply ingrained to be psychologically congruent with how we see ourselves, we often reject our external experiences that don't line up with our internal reality. Thus, we don't see the world the way it is, we see the world the way we are. So a lot of my work with my clients is this first stage, is integrating your human experience. So I'll pause there. I know there was a lot of different pieces. You
So,
could probably
and this rings true from my years as a licensed marriage and family therapist. That license is the most systemic of all of them, meaning you view the human through the lens of the system they grew up in. They grew up in a system, they had experiences, those experiences taught them beliefs. They then form habits based on those beliefs. They then form brain chemistry and challenges and everything because of those habits that they're experiencing. So it's the one I think is most effective in treating life problems because it is systemic. It's not a medical view. So from that approach, it is the experiences that begin shaping your beliefs. Sometimes those experiences are representative of the larger whole. Many times they're not.
I'm kind of curious. So we're talking about conflict, and we actually started with this beautiful notion and a very high theoretical notion, but you're familiar with conflict closely from your practical standpoint, right? So Sebastian, I've looked into you quite a bit, and you have some fantastic work, but you also have some fantastic accomplishments. Could you tell us a little bit about what are your key things and what role being able to have a productive confrontation actually played in shaping those experiences for you?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Yeah, I don't know. I don't frame my life in terms of accomplishments. So I'm gonna try to answer your question as authentically as I can, for what I think you're trying to tease out of it. I will say I've ran the same company for 15 years. We have my executive staff. The tenure in my executive staff is over 10 years, and for me, that's an accomplishment. We've 10 years. I think we're 10 or 11 years into best places to work in Orange County, and we have 35, I think 36 offices now across the country, 400 employees and growing. And so conflict is part of the game.
That's a lot of offices. What do you guys do?
My start, and it's still part of my core business, is building sales and marketing campaigns for some of the largest brands in the world down to a zip code. And so we do targeted, mostly omni-channel marketing for brands like AT&T. We've worked with Amazon in the past, Verizon, big brands, helping them capture market share in specific markets. And generally, we would say NFL cities or big cities. So that's where I started. And in result, um, a lot of the work I do is in leadership and development. And so for me, the process I'm always asking myself is, what is the one thing that only I can do?
So let's dive into that. How to think. Many of the people in our audience are, when they hear the word conflict, they are nervous. It feels horrible, right? There is going to be conflict in your romantic relationship. There is going to be conflict at work. And many of them, that gets their adrenaline surging, their cortisol floods. They kind of shake. They're like, I don't know if I want to go to work tomorrow knowing that, right? Can you talk to us? Is conflict a bad thing? How should we think about conflict?
It is not, I would say it is not inherently a bad thing. Um, like many of the tools that we have in our toolbox, the misuse is where it becomes a problem. I think somewhere as far as I can tell, we can follow it back to the late 70s, early 80s, where we start getting this prevalent message that we don't talk about sex, we don't talk about politics, we don't talk about religion, we don't talk about the things that matter most. And then we wonder why we now live in a time period where people are incredibly inept at dealing with conflict and dealing with disagreement. Well, we've been at least 2 generations conditioning them to say it's bad to talk about those things, stay away from those things. And so now we live in an age where we have a term for it, ghosting. And ghosting isn't just a dating thing. It happens in business too, where instead of dealing with disagreement, it would be easier for the person to just leave, to disappear. And I have clients in tech. I have clients in the industrial sector, like all over the board, that are all dealing with the same behavior. In fact, I haven't found a segment of the economy where we aren't seeing this behavior, specifically, mostly among the youngest generation, where instead of dealing with disagreement, instead of dealing with conflict, it's much easier for them to just leave.
So, while I do like the topic of conflict, actually, there's something that was really interesting to me that caught my ear, and that is your work with the people in their 20s. I'm very curious to see, and I'm very curious to get your take on it. What is exactly that those guys are getting wrong? Right? If we're talking about conflict, let's actually have a little chat about what is not going well for that generation and what is it going to mean.
I'm very curious about this myself because we've had members of Gen Z on this channel before, and a lot of them are in my audience out there listening right now. And I try to encourage them and say, look, you will only ever form relationships through conflict. That's really the depth of where it comes from. That's where trust is formed. Talk to us a little bit about what you are seeing among that population as far as conflict avoidance.
Or even without conflict.
Or even
Well,
without
I
conflict.
like the subject of conflict, but at the same time, there's more to it than this, right? So let's also see what else there is and what else we can say, and what are the main trends? What are going to be the real challenges that we're going to have to resolve together? Both Gen Z generations, their younger siblings or younger friends, eventually their kids, but also their parents, their brothers or sisters, their managers, all of this stuff. Because in that truth, really, in their subjective reality, we're going to be finding the basis of our objective reality very quickly.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Well said. Well, I'd say a few things. I mean, I only go so far with generational trends and categorizing in a whole group of people based on their age. I think there are general rules that we can operate from, and then there are always exceptions, right, to every generation. But Neil Howe wrote a great book called The Fourth Turning. They wrote a book called Generations, him and his partner who passed away, William Strauss. They wrote Generations, and they wrote The Fourth Turning at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. And Generations is a historical tome, and for those who enjoy history, you may enjoy it. The Fourth Turning is really kind of a summation or crux of, hey, here's why this is important now. But they use data to accurately predict 9/11, cryptocurrency, the 2008 financial crisis, and a lot of the trend. COVID was another one, and a lot of the trends that we're seeing among this generation, or what we would say is Gen Z. And they're not woo-woo. It wasn't a prophetic kind of jump. They were looking at data, and they were looking at history and going, hey, here's what we see in history. And it turns out, every fourth generation, history seems to repeat itself. We're repeating itself constantly, but in generational
It's about
cycles of
what, about
4
100 years, 4 generations?
80 to 100. Yeah, exactly. And so Neil points out, is like, hey, like we've been here before. Go back 80 years from now, and you're dealing with World War II, the Great Depression, and World War I. Go back 80 years from there, roughly, and you get the Civil War. Go back 80 years from there, you get the Revolutionary War, which in some ways can sound a little scary because, like, holy shit, what are we sitting on top of? But history repeats itself because humans are, well, human.
What is the composition of the identity of the Gen Z generation? Because the knowledge that they got from their parents is largely inapplicable or lost, and they're actually getting their identity from elsewhere. So where are they sourcing that that sense of presence and the sense of identity in themselves?
That's a great question, and there are a handful of things that I would point to that seem to be unprecedented in this tranche of human history, we'll say. One, they're getting it from each other, which is fascinating, right? And largely through social media. You'll see this. There is a big difference between a kid who grew up off screen versus on screen, on the way their perspective of the world, how they show up in the world, their values. But a lot of what is being shaped is by technology and each other, which is an interesting sounding board, to be sure. Easy to get echo chambered, but they wouldn't be the first group to make that mistake. But I think some of the things, the prevalent themes that you see, is that they consistently believe the world is worse for them than it was for the last generation, which is a phase that many of them will grow through. They tend to think that the world is worse off. They tend to be more worried about community than they are an individual. So they tend to be more socially minded than individually minded. Versus Gen X, who is many of their parents were very individually minded and very anti-establishment, anti-system, very independent. So again, very often we look at the last generation and go, I don't want to be that. So we define ourselves as the opposite of what we saw. And this isn't new to Gen Z. This has been going on as far as recorded history goes. There's themes here.
So there's a very interesting stat that you talk about a lot, Adam, and that is that our attachment to society is very rapidly degenerating. It's getting worse. What is that stat?
Yeah, so the research on this is fascinating. So when it comes to attachment styles, the way that we form bonds with our caregivers, the generation before us, the way we form bonds with them, and we determine through conflict if they will collaborate with us or if they will shut us down. Can we have conflict with our caregivers and it works out and we're still safe, right? So the research with the boomers showed that they were about 35% insecure and about 65% secure. So 65% of boomers were able to effectively attach to their caregivers and say, you will collaborate with me, you'll be reasonable, and we'll be able to work together. When it comes to Gen X, Gen Y, and millennials, the research suggests only about 50% of Gen X, Gen Y, and millennials were able to effectively bond with their boomer parents and form collaborative relationships with them. With Gen Z, the research indicates that only 35% have been able to effectively, securely attach and collaborate, with the other 65% saying, I cannot collaborate with my caregivers. It's either my fault, I'm unlovable somehow, or it's everybody else's fault because they're insane. So this escalation, what this usually tracks and correlates with, is a society that is collapsing. We usually see that under very dangerous circumstances, famines, invasions, things like that, Viking attacks that burn your village to the ground. That's
World
where we
Wars.
see this. World War, well, yes, but where it devastates you, the sort of devastation we've seen in Eastern Europe through the world wars and things like that most of us in the West, America, for example, can't really fathom. We've seen it in videos, but we haven't really experienced it on our soil to that extent. But we're still seeing the effects of it here, which is fascinating. And that seems to be a fundamental breakdown, really, where we are in a perceived collapse where the generations are now doing that. And Gen Z is expressing themselves that way with survival adaptations. That seems to be why we're seeing this hard split between those who are, I don't want to say enjoying the decline or driving off into insanity behaviors where they're simply falling apart, but then also that very careful obsessive pragmatism where they are doing away with extraneous things, where they are focusing into that. We do seem to be seeing that split of I will survive in hard conditions versus I don't know what I'm doing and I'm simply losing my mind. Have you seen that split? Is that data correlating with what you're experiencing out there?
Yeah, to the degree I wish I'd say, I wouldn't say this is a unique phenomenon that's tied to this moment in history. It is a repeating pattern. But yes, in a patternistic way, that is one of the kind of indicators of where we are in the fourth turning. People become increasingly more populist. They become more tied to their individual communities. They're more concerned about their individual communities than the whole. And identity becomes a really big thing. So you see more, you're the Republican, you're a Democrat, you're part of this group, you're part of that group, whatever it is, everything becomes more populist and it's our way or the highway. No one wants to work together and collaborate, or that begins to break down. And it certainly, and I think we're at a stat right now that I think 40% of Americans are anticipating a civil war. They're 38%, pretty high group. Ray Dalio brought this up. Pretty fascinating. I will say this is not the first time in human history or even American history that we have been here. And so one of the illusions, I have three illusions frameworks that I use in helping people awaken and remember who they are, going back to where we started this conversation. One of the illusions is surrendering the illusion of specialness and or separateness. The specialness illusion is this belief that somehow our suffering is special, that no time in human history has anybody had to deal with this, which is, again, if you were bored in history class, this is why history is important. If you study history, you begin to realize this isn't new, it's not unique, and we're not going through some special kind of suffering. It may be special relative to you, but this is human, right? And being able to surrender that can help you see more clearly about where we are in human history. The illusion of separateness is this idea that I have, that I'm separate from the other, which ties back to specialness, right? We either believe we're special in our gifting or special in our suffering. And most of the population takes special in my suffering because it helps us feel significant, psychological need in our story of identity. And so here we are in an amplified time in history where that is prevalent. Identity, personal identity, has never been a bigger issue in our time period anyway, where everything is becoming about identity and story of self. And we are getting more divided within our groups. And so, yes, now, why that's happening, again, I would offer has much to do with generational cycles than any one thing going on in our society. And I don't think it takes a whole lot of work to look around objectively and realize that we have created a much better world for ourselves as humans, if you're looking at the span of human history, than ever in human history. I would challenge anyone to just go ahead and point to a time where you think it was better to be alive, that quality of life was better. Right? You're not going to find it. Maybe for particular people groups, if you try to dial down on a micro, you will be able to, but on a macro, you're not going to find it. And so then for me, the question becomes, well, why does one generation have such a hard time bonding with the last generation? And that's a fascinating stat and an interesting way to look at the caregiver relationship. But those would be fascinating to get into. Well, what's our story? And so there's an old, I think Maslow gets credit for the saying, but it holds true. He who's good with a hammer sees everything as a nail. The boomer generation went through one of the most, it may go down as the best time in economic history for Americans, and they succeeded at a level that was very much in a bubble. It only lasted for about their generation. But without awareness, your story about identity gets crystallized over time. And so now you're trying to use a hammer on everything without being able to recognize things have changed. Right? It's not the way it was in the 50s and the 60s, for better or for worse. But we err if we misapply our knowledge from 50 years ago, 60 years ago, to a time that is no longer relevant. And that's very often where that connection breaks down, is because you have one generation that can't relate to the last generation, because to them, they're speaking nonsense, because they live in a world that no longer exists. And that has a lot to do with your story of self and awareness. And I'm not saying things are worse than it was 50, 60 years ago, but a lot of the things that you could do 50, 60 years ago don't apply anymore. We have to continue to evolve our knowledge and understanding. And I would say in that, principles don't go away. Principles, a true principle, tends to be fairly timeless, but our methodology and approach needs to continually evolve as we go. And that's where we get stuck when we say things like, well, that's the way we've always done it. And the American dream looks a lot different today than it did when boomers were making their place in the world.
Okay, so what does the American dream look like now? What is the American dream?
Well, the fundamental principle, going back to our forefathers, was freedom. But freedom, 2 points. Freedom is one, messy. And especially when we go into social establishment, which is the direction we're going, personal freedom begins to get muted because personal freedom is messy. When you allow people the freedom to do what they want, you also are allowing them the freedom to be total asshats and make bad decisions and be messy. I would offer, though, that freedom, the upside of that is, in the end, a more developed group of people who now understand experientially why to do something and not to do something. But in times of big change, we tend to go back to social morale and what is best for the most people. And there is a emphasis on personal freedom, which we're seeing right now, right? It's more about the whole. Benjamin Franklin, or it was Thomas Jefferson, one of the two said, I think it was Benjamin Franklin though, said, who is willing to give up their essential freedom for safety deserves neither, right? Safety or
I
security.
will lose both.
Because we will lose both. And we've seen this, right? Patriot Act was an interesting time in our history. We were pissed off about 9/11, relatively so, but we gave up a lot of essential freedom quickly and with great vigor for what we thought was for the greater good.
Yeah, and one thing that I got to point out is this gravitation towards mini groups and micro groups, right? Everybody is now following content creators. Everybody is following their little self-identified bubbles, and it becomes a very important part of their identity. We are seeing a splintering of relationships. We're seeing a splintering of families. And this is actually why I'm very curious to hear a little bit more about the interaction of your work, both of your work, is what comes next. Well, because so many young families and even, millennial families, older families, are now suffering with a question of identity. Are our interests as a family less important than the interests of a group, a society, whatever? And what is it like for me to be an individual in the context of a relationship? I think that's also changing. What do you think, Adam?
I agree with that. So I've worked with, over the last 10 years alone, I've worked with thousands of clients through therapy and through coaching. And again, people keep coming in with this idea that they need to go find themselves, that their identity is somewhere out there in the world. They have to discover it. Unfortunately, many of them try to look for it under the nearest person, and they jump into bed under the nearest blanket.
Or the nearest YouTube channel,
or anything that is dopamine saturated, really. And then they start pulling in identifiers of things that they enjoy, or they pull in pieces of self that they think are self. And unfortunately, what most of them miss, and Sebastian, maybe you can work with me on this and figure out if this is the key piece here. What most of them miss is that we craft our identity through the decisions we make every day. Are we pursuing our principles and staying true to them? Are we pursuing goals and staying true to those? It's not even about marking achievements. It's pursuing a greater purpose. And then how you pursue it, how you engage in it. Can people trust you? Who are you? Are you a predictable pattern of behavior aligning with your principles and your purpose? If you are, that is identity. If you are not, that also is identity. And you'll have to run and cope and hide and deal with that until you're ready to handle it and become a better version of self. But we invent that identity with every decision we make. If I quit everything I do right now and go become a drug addict on the street, my identity changes because of my choices I have made. I'm no longer the person that I am. But if I am a drug addict on the street and I choose to reinvent myself and live in alignment with my principles and in alignment with greater purpose, then that is who I become. I cease to be the person I was before. I'm not a collection of hobbies or interests or any of
group
those.
affiliations, right? So we're talking about malleability. You're saying that you actually have significant control over your identity and how you're going to be manifesting that existence in your
Full
form.
control.
You have full control. That also means that you will be equally as malleable based on what you believe and who you follow. right? So who you follow, who you consume will define that.
So
But at
how
the
do you
same
determine
time,
that? Your principles and your purpose. That
so
determines
it's
who
more of
you're
a
going with.
curation more than anything, right? So what happens is that as we are learning how to be in the world, that's increasing more divisive, more consuming, and more attractive. Actually, everybody and everything is now marketing itself. Every person that has an online presence, every company is out there trying to imprint their identity on you. And we're actually curating more than anything. We're curating what is right, what is wrong, based on our internal moral principles. I'm curious, Sebastian, what role do you see this definition of your personal principles playing in this, definition of your social identity? And then down the line, how is that going to impact us as we go through this huge societal change?
We well, there was a lot that was said there, but there's a few pieces I'd love to touch on. Our story of self is generally tied to our experiential knowledge, our perception of the world, right? So, as an example, if you grew up in a town where everyone was a Republican and all you knew was Republicans, it would not be unreasonable for you to think everyone is a Republican because your experience tells you everyone is, or vice versa, or any story. And mostly by design, that is how we interface with the world, especially if we are still unconscious. We allow our personal experience to tell us what is true and what makes sense to us. And I think that is one of the birthrights of showing up on this rock, is getting to experience all of that. And what is it like? The work then becomes in exchanging what we could say is an inferior truth or an inferior value system for a superior one. And if we are seeking truth, we will probably be doing this for the rest of our life. There was a great study that was done by the World Economic Forum. Whether or not you like the World Economic Forum or not is beside the point, but they spent some time on this study that they were looking for defining characteristics of lasting success, or we could say of lasting relevant people. So these are people that have been successful and relevant for decades, not for years. Like, how do they continue to stay relevant? So you could think of Sir Richard Branson as an example. But there were a few characteristics that continue to show up. Number one, and the basis of much of my work, is self-awareness. It's the beginning of everything. Without a conscious understanding of your behavior, it's very hard for anything to change. So we could say anywhere we get an unintended consequence, positive or negative, we likely lack self-awareness, or we could say awareness. But the next one in there is being a lifelong learner, or being an agile learner, our ability to pivot our position in light of superior information. And this gets increasingly hard as we get older. In the scientific community, it's largely understood if you don't come up with a new theorem by the time you were 35, you most likely never will, because you become crystallized in your paradigm of the world. Your story of yourself, the other, and the world becomes crystallized to the point in which you will not likely discover something new, because you're simply existing in the world that you created in your head. So being a lifelong learner is important, our ability to continue to create and learn. And that means that we are upgrading our identity constantly. We're upgrading our story of self constantly in light of new systems. But to Zeke's point about values, we are always doing what we value most. The easiest way to learn about oneself is just pay attention to what one continually does. Not what they say, per se, but what they do. We are always doing what we value most in that moment. And when I say that, it's generally challenging to someone. I remember I was saying this in front of a large group of people, and a woman raised her hand. She goes, no, that's not true. I go, well, please explain. Because I go see movies with my dad all the time that I don't like. And I just sat there quietly, and she goes, I value hanging out with my dad more than the movie. Exactly. We always do what we value most. If you want to understand yourself, Pay attention to the decisions you continually make. They will demonstrate your values. Your values for an unconscious human are largely predicated on what you think is most beneficial to you. That is largely predicated upon your life experience to this point and the things that you went through and how you decided to deal with the things that you went through in those experiences, good or bad. And without any kind of conscious intervention, you will continue to live that loop and continue to make the same decisions, which is why people get stuck and they get confused, why they can't seem to get themselves out of whatever situation they're in, or they keep finding themselves dating the same people, or they find themselves continually stuck in the same financial situation, or they find themselves in the same physical situation. And if you can't solve for you, your only frame of reference is going to be to the other. So because you can't solve for you, you will look outward inherently. Thus, your consciousness level generally sits, which is about at least 80% of the world, sits at life is happening to me. I'm at the effects of life. I am not in control. And you'll hear that in expressions like, well, people who are wealthy just got lucky or inherited it. You hear that in expressions like, I'm unlucky in relationships. Or somebody who physically struggles will say, it's just my genetics. It's just my DNA. Now, could there be truth to those things? Sure. The best lies tend to be 60% truth. But the more important point is anywhere we're disempowering ourselves in that story from being part of the solution, we're going to inherently begin to get angry, frustrated, and continue to look out into the world seeking control because we think it's the outer environment that's creating our inner environment, which couldn't be more opposite. It's exactly the opposite. Our inner world is creating our outer world. So I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but trying to
But I
get
do
into
like
your
this
point would
direction,
be,
and part of the reason I like is because it actually shows you there's two ways to deal with that internal conflict. And the internal conflict could be that you're blaming everybody else for what is happening to you, and then you're either seeking vengeance or you're seeking justice, right? So many fights, so many arguments in the workplace, in relationships happen because people are seeking to make an excuse and remediate the way they feel about themselves. And that's option A. Or option B is that you actually have to now go out and take responsibility for whatever is happening to you, be it just or not, and then have to find some form of an outcome. Now, let's come back to the question of now relationships, especially young relationships. Adam, how do you see the skills playing out would prevent you from going down into the destructive argument that is going to, just make you want to fight with your wife or your girlfriend or, your husband over and over and over again and actually turn this into something that's positive?
To Sebastian's points, experience. Number one, you have to experience either as a child or as an adolescent or as an adult. You have to have an experience that tells you another human being is capable of working with you. If you don't have that experience, then you have a limited belief and you have a fractured sense of reality that nobody is capable of ever working with you, which is what creates the attachment issues in the first place. I've seen this time and again with my coaching clients. I had a couple just this morning that they are only now in their late 50s as a married couple emerging from this idea that no one on the planet will ever work with them. And they've been married for 25 years, but they've lived all 25 years combatively, trying to get around each other, navigating around each other, because they've never opened up to the experience that the other person may actually work with them. So they've both been trapped, not only in that marriage, but also in families, raising their children, with every circumstance they've been in. So now through a few sessions, they've been able to learn, okay, maybe that person is actually trying to work with me, and maybe it's actually me resisting. And as they stop resisting, they have a singular experience where they say, wow, somebody tried to work with me. And at least the trying to work with you, that is enough to crack that open and then say, okay, maybe there's something else here. And again, to Sebastian's point, that experience is everything. You must have that initial experience of somebody somewhere trying to work with you.
And let's just say that they never really had that at home. They never really had that maybe growing up. They never really had a family, not to say that, cares, but one that is able to provide that experience of safety. How does somebody find that? Or how do they discover that within themselves sufficiently they can build it in their life?
So changing one's mind, right? And this is the work. Sometimes a great therapist can help you with that. Sometimes a great coach can help you with that. Sometimes just having an amazing friend circle, an upgraded friend circle that has a different story of the world can help shift this. Sometimes it's just personal work. In some ways, it's easier now than it's ever been because we have access to information at our fingertips that wasn't even accessible 20 years ago. Right? We get content that we can look at that challenges our story of the world. And so I actively I get I get a lot of questions around this with my followers. I follow a lot of different people from a lot of different walks of life, and I love that because it rounds out my experience and story of the world and allows me a space to continually challenge what I think is real, what I think is effective, what I think is true. And so I'm not I don't it's a tricky setup because of the human design, but I would not fully rely on your individual experience to help define your reality, especially if your individual experience is not serving you. Right? So I'll ask people very often in coaching sessions, like, how is this belief system serving you? How is your story about the world making your life better? And inevitably, especially if it's one that's been causing them a lot of pain, they usually will say it's not. And then they're confronted with, but you believe it? And they say yes, right? Which gets to the story of self and their desire to be congruent and believing that I have cornered the market on truth, experiential knowledge. So I'll use an example that kind of breaks this for people. I use this in my office all the time. One of my business partners, I'm in the middle of a class, and one of my business partners comes into the room and they start yelling, there's a bomb, we got to get out of this building, the building's going to blow up. Well, to the degree in which you believe her, you are deciding based on your value system what you're going to do about it. For some people, they may run out of the building as fast as they could. Some may try to jump out of the building. Some may carry other people with them. Some people may clamber over the top of others to try to get out. Most people are probably lives flashing before their eyes. They're thinking about the things they regret or they wish they would have done, the people they wish they would have called. All of these stories of the experience become very, very real, and people are acting accordingly. Everybody gets out safely. We're sitting in the parking lot. Sandra, my business partner, comes up behind all of us and she's laughing her ass off. She thinks this is the most hilarious thing in the world. Well, was the experience real? Yeah. Fuck yeah, it was real. It just happened to be based on a lie. This is why I have a very hard time with using emotion and personal experience as a way to definitively understand our world. And one could say, well, what other choice do we have? That's kind of how we're hardwired. I would say I agree, but I would encourage the other to constantly seek truth first and question everything they believe by testing it through principle. Right? We're in a society that seems to be obsessed with the exception. We want to argue, we want to discount what people say because of an exception. And I think this is hilarious and just speaks of opportunity, because I'll say to my Texas Hold'em friends, you could win with 7-2 offsuit, right? Could you? Yeah, sure. Anybody plays Hold'em, you know what I'm talking about. If you pre-flop, you get 7-2, you're on the big blind. Maybe you don't pay to get in because nobody forces you out. The flop comes 7-2-2. You got a full boat on the flop. Could you win with that hand? Absolutely. Should you be in that hand? No. Probably the worst thing that could happen to you is that you hold on to 7-2, because if you win with it, and you're totally unaware, which happens all the time at casinos, you now begin to think this is a good hand. And so now you're playing it because your experience tells you it worked once. And I've seen this happen to people lots and lots of times in different areas of their life. So I'm trying to teach general principles that work most of the time. Does everything work all of the time? I don't know. But I know that if you live by general principles, your life is going to be far better than constantly trying to play the exception. And we all, again, under the illusion of specialness, we want to play the exception. And so we'll argue for it. Anytime a general rule is brought up, somebody wants to say, well, what about and they want to share their personal experience. Well, I'm sorry, your personal experience in a sea of a million isn't a relevant example. There may be counterexamples, But continue to play the counterexamples if you want. I'll continue to play the rules, and I promise you, my life is going to be far more fulfilling and stable than somebody who is constantly seeking the exception. So I would, the question in that for me is just always be questioning what you believe. Always be curious about what you believe. In any area of your life where you're saying things like, well, that's what I was taught, or that's how we do things in my country, or that's what it's like in my culture, or that's what it's like in my family, or that's the way I was raised, or that's what my teacher taught me. Any of those examples don't inherently mean that what you believe is false, but it does mean that you seem unconscious of why to do those things, or why to believe those things, which means you may want to do the work of figuring out whether it continues to be valid or not, going back to this generational difference.
So, how do you tell somebody that they're potentially wrong? How do you really challenge somebody without creating negative conflict and turning into a learning opportunity, and also showing
Ask
them that you
questions,
care?
don't make statements. That's how you do it. Don't make statements, ask questions. Penetrating questions are insanely sticky. So if you ask the right question, right, out of genuine curiosity, not as an indictment or a statement toned in a question, but a genuine question, it'll do the work, because something deep inside of them it will go to work on, because they can't answer it. Right? And they may give you a flippant answer to start, and then your goal is to surrender the illusion of control of other and let it go. Right? That's okay. So one of my favorite questions to ask people is, how does this serve you? Or how are you complicit in creating the reality you say you don't want? Or how do you know this is true? Are you absolutely certain this is true? How does it make you feel believing this is true? What would it be like if this wasn't true? You're creating a space for them to explore a different reality, which is, I think, part of the work of a good therapist or coach.
And what are some good questions that you ask or you would suggest somebody asks if they're getting into that situation?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, to Sebastian's point, what he's talking about there's motivational interviewing, which is a fantastic approach. You have to ask questions. You can't hammer it into someone's head. I remember back in graduate school, one of my mentors, he talked to us and he said, look, he was 75, 80 years old. He'd been in the game for a long time working with patients. And he said, if you go in to a room with somebody who has destructive behaviors, the worst thing you can do is yell at them for having those destructive behaviors, or tell them they're wrong, or list off how they're bad, because everybody in their life is doing that, and they're doing that to themselves inside their head. So you just join a chorus of people yelling at them. They have no reason to care about you, and they have no reason to engage with you. He said, if you go in with genuine curiosity and ask them the good parts of whatever it is they're doing, great. Hey, you know what? You were addicted to heroin? Tell me what's good about that. I've never used it before. What is so great about it? It must be something. You know, people trade all these things for it. So what is great about it? Tell me. And the question itself startles them because they've never had someone try to understand them often. And then they get to talk about something that is a positive in their eyes that they're doing. It serves them in some way. And a similar question. And then it rolls forward into a next question. And when I use this 9 times out of 10, people start talking about the good. And then they themselves roll into the but, and they start talking about all the drawbacks or whatever it is, but they've opened up because you're curious. A spirit of curiosity is usually what disarms.
It's very difficult, I find, for people to learn this type of conversation if they haven't had the chance to practice. And this is kind of a bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? Is that you don't know how to do have the conversation, so you don't have the conversation. Because you don't have the conversation, you can't learn how to have the conversation. What are some techniques that somebody can follow to learn that? Maybe Sebastian and Adam, I'm very curious what your opinion on that is.
So one of the leading indicator for me that somebody's identity is tied to their belief system, which is almost always the case, is the response to that belief system being questioned. And so to reverse engineer that as an individual, if you're having a hard time surrendering a story of the world, a story of self, evaluate how often you are triggered by stories, information, or questions that challenge your story about the world. The reason we tend to not be very good at this is because we are emotionally invested in our story of the world. If what I believe isn't true, what does that say about me? So one of the ways we surrender this is to resolve the internal work of identity. Right? We are, I would offer, and try it on for size, that when we leave this meat suit, it will not be our religious affiliation, our political affiliation, or our sex, or our race, or whatever the fill in the blank identity you want to put in there that we're going to remember. None of that comes with us. Yet how much time and energy do we spend vested in defending those things? I think it's divine comedy personally, but hilarious. So when we are able to surrender for, and a good therapist and a good coach does this well. They solve for themselves by removing them from the equation, meaning they minimize their own stories of self and minimize their own biases in order to create an objective place for the other to show up and to do the work. This is incredibly hard, and some may believe impossible, but I think with practice you can get to a point where you are removing your stories of the world, so it creates a space for the person to, basically you act as a mirror. You allow the person to see themselves in a mirror that is non-judgmental, but in frame, increasing emotional intelligence, becoming an empathetic listener, learning how to objectively listen, intuitively listen. As a fundamental principle, seek first to understand, then to be understood. Those things will all go a long ways towards making you much more effective in reaching the other and understanding yourself.
I like that. Adam, what do you recommend? How does one practice these skills?
Well, I can speak to my own experience, being formed as a therapist, being formed through the mentorship of others. For me, it was astounding when my mentor sat me down and started asking me questions. And I remember laughing when I had my very, very first session with him, and he would ask questions, and I would laugh because the questions hit so hard and they made me think.
Hmm.
And it was delightful to be hit and poked that hard on the inside. And then I would answer it. And he would ask another one, and it was enlightening that somebody could speak this way and that we could really conversate in that manner. I was young at the time, and thank goodness I've had years and years of life with those skills. But for someone to speak to you that way and initiate you into this understanding of being able to engage with the world in that way, it was phenomenal. And it has opened a whole world to me to be able to conversate that way. So I seek now with my coaching clients to try to do the same and to give them that experience and have that conversation. And then what I tell them is the conversations you and I have and even the connection or the relationship that we form should be small compared to the relationships and conversations you have in your daily life and the people that are around you. So what you have learned here, go apply tenfold out there, 100-fold, and experience so much more. That is the goal.
Do you guys role play at all with your clients? I'm kind of curious.
At times, some people prefer it, some people despise it. The ones who prefer it are very experiential and they learn a great deal from it. Other people want the theory.
How about you, Sebastian? Do you guys do any type of mimicking role play? You know, hey, if you're having challenge in a conversation with your husband, your wife, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your boss, you know, assume you're him. Assume that I'm me. What would you say?
Yeah, I've been using role playing as part of my process for a better part of a decade. It does, to Zeke's point, it somewhat depends on the client though and how it is they process information. But it is something, especially in group settings, we'll teach a principle and then we'll have them apply it in conversation by having them pair off and practice those conversations. If you can create the neural pathways that become familiar with them on how to do these exercises in a safe place, it gets easier to do them when you're being challenged. So I think role playing can be an effective tool for teaching people how to have these kinds of conversations for sure.
Do that at all in group settings, Adam?
I'm going to. So I've got a retreat that I'm building toward the end of the year. I'm going to be pulling in people to do a lot of role play because it is, when they're open and receptive to it, it can be a phenomenal experiential tool for them to learn right there and then really feel it. And then they can take it home after that retreat and use it when they've felt it, when they've seen it.
Yeah, and this is kind of the interesting thing for me too. And it seems that when it comes to kind of overcoming conflict, we talked, a couple of different aspects of this. There's the understanding of your own positions and when you may be right, when you may not be right, when you're speaking to the truth or what you think to be the truth, when you're challenging the truth, and when you're just reacting. But then there's also the experiential step of, okay, great, now what? You figured out that you may be potentially out of bounds or out of balance. But then you also need to have these skill sets in order to be able to go and readjust and relearn and not feel like your whole world is falling apart. We started the conversation also talking about Gen Zers and how they are different. They tend to avoid conflict. They tend to ghost. They tend to kind of not have these skills, and then they're not really building them very well because they're not particularly applicable online. You don't get into long form discussions with strangers on the internet. Usually, if somebody's going on a rant, it's not for a good reason. It's not definitely for a polemic discussion or a Socratic conversation. It's usually something that's confrontational and very emotionally loaded. So if we go back to this idea of Gen Zs and kind of conflict, intergenerational conflict, how does one learn to be better at this if, let's say, they're young, if they're in their 20s, they have no one to practice with, maybe they can't afford a coach, maybe they don't really have anybody in their friend group that is competent at doing that yet. What is kind of the foundational layer of learning this skill, Sebastian?
Well, we could say that we are more connected than we've ever been, yet we are more lonely. And the technology has made us more inept in how we communicate with one another. And potentially there's a solid argument for that. I think I would offer it has far more to do with our current academic system and how it is we teach and develop kids and what our intention with that is. And those are simply, in the beginning of the show, you asked me the things that I like to talk about or I spend most of my time on. And a lot of it is what I call the big three: health, wealth, and relationships. In America, you probably went to school for 12 years, maybe 16 years. And yet I would be willing to make a strong bet than less than 5%, and I'm being generous, of what the emphasis in your education system was on health, wealth, and relationships. We don't prioritize it. Unless you're getting it at home, you are not likely being taught what to think, or how to think rather. You are being taught what to think. And our entire system is really built around what to think. And from an efficiency standpoint, I can argue for that. It seems like a cleaner path. It's easier to control people if you teach them what to think, for sure. Teaching people how to think is a messier process because you're inviting them to do the work themselves to varying degrees of success. But it isn't something that we value yet as a society. I'm encouraged, though, that, again, when you react to error, that very often creates more error. I think we're going to swing so far, we are swinging so far, that we're going to see a return to more conservative values. We're going to see a return to more base relationship behaviors that are sustainable as people want these things, right? Very often people don't change until staying the same is more painful than changing. And when we get to the end of our belief systems, which happens a lot, and usually at the end of our 20s, where we begin to realize a lot of what we believed was bullshit and it didn't show up in the world, we'll desire change. But as I said before, to answer your question directly, I don't think it's ever been easier to grow and to change, in that we have access to information at our fingertips that presidents didn't have 20 years ago, right? It's wild. So if you want it, you'll find it. So what would I do? I'd listen to podcasters that ask great questions, that get into good conversation, and I'd watch long form. So I want to pay attention to the rhythm of the conversation. I want to pay attention to people who ask good questions and then build on those questions. Specifically, instead of going into a rapid fire questions, they're building on a question that was or an answer that was off their last question. So it shows that they're at least objectively listening, maybe intuitive listening, but they're demonstrating the values and the behaviors that I'm looking for. Most of this stuff is caught more than it is taught. So, and what we put in us comes out of us in all forms, right? We are, the way our whole human being works is an energetic expression of what we are absorbing. So whatever you put in you is going to come out of you. If you're reading great books, if you're listening to great podcasts, inevitably, if that's what you're digesting, that is what's going to come out of you. So just having a conscious and constant growth plan for yourself to develop and grow in these areas can go a very, very long way. There's a very old book that is antiquated in its language, but its principles are timeless: How to Win Friends and Influence People. I wish somebody would maybe write a updated version of it with language that isn't so antiquated. But the principles there are still valid. And it's a great place to start. I recommend anyone read it that is trying to strengthen their ability to communicate effectively and to be influential, to be relevant. Although, again, I hope we come up with an updated version. Although I enjoy the history of it, but I think the last Gen Z may get really irritated with the language style.
What do you think should be changed, or what is no longer applicable from that book?
It's not the principles that aren't applicable, it's the language. So I
Interesting.
think it may be a bit to overcome for some who can't get around the language barrier.
Context.
Yep.
Modern context. How about you, Adam? What do you think? What's the best way for you to learn these skills when it comes to proper listening, when it comes to asking these questions? If you don't have role models, if you don't have coaches, if you don't have a therapist, what's available to you?
Well, that is the question, because we have never been more connected, but never been more alone either. There's so much separation. Humans have not really been able to live in such tiny, isolated little pockets before. To have a little cubicle home in a little apartment building with DoorDash, where things are simply delivered to your front door, and you never have to experience another human ever again if you don't want to. It's a very strange time. I think that we will have to do something we've never really done much throughout our human history, which is to go out and seek intentional daily interaction with others. We have this idea
It's
of,
like taking vitamin D pill.
yeah,
You can go out to see the sun; it's right
a
there.
little bit.
But instead,
If you have to live away from the sun, you have to supplement. I think we have this idea of proximity humans. We used to have proximity humans around us, and we do still growing up in our school systems and whatnot. We are losing many of our proximity relationships, and now we have to really cultivate intentional ones. So whether that's podcasting, many people begin there, and this helps people feel not alone. I had a coaching client the other day say, Adam, I listen to Dr. John Deloney all the time. He makes me feel not alone in my home. I love having Dr. John Deloney with me while I am folding my laundry. And shout out to him. He was on the show recently. But that is the level of connection people are forming with these podcasts. The goal is to then say, what's the next step, right? You begin with podcasting. You begin with creators. Maybe you go to meetups where those creators are, or retreats or events. You join communities. You join curated, protected communities. But at some point, you need to make full contact with other humans and begin really drawing that in, right? What Sebastian has said, what you take into yourself is what you get out of yourself. So begin fashioning those relationships. I think that they have always been vital, no matter which turning you might be in. Your human relationships are what determine your quality of life in many instances.
yeah.
Learn there.
As we were saying at the beginning of this conversation too, Sebastian made a great point that we're really segmenting a society. We're trying to assume the identity of various sizes of groups. Whether it's following a content creator, like I really, example, really like John Deloney, whether it's you're listening to a particular podcast series, as Sebastian suggesting, whether or not you're associating with a bigger subgroup like a Republican or a Democrat. Eventually, it's all great to teach you the concepts of principles, but not until you expose them into practice and you apply them in practice is that actually going to do anything. And that's one of the things that you talk about, Sebastian, as well, is that you have to have a lived experience in order to really become anything that you've consumed. And that's one of the things that you've referred to as well as a human expression of your soul. As we're kind of bringing the podcast to a close, what could you leave us with in terms of wisdom when it comes to this expression and how it's going to help us live a better, more interconnected life and hopefully help us get through the next challenging decade or so that is coming up?
Yeah, there's a few things that I would offer as operating principles. Lean into discomfort. Be aware of where you're operating out of fear. Right, so much. I would offer the opposite of fear is love. To the degree in which we know fear in any area, we don't know love. To the degree in which we know love, we don't know fear. And I think about my 2-year-old son, who will fearlessly, or did when he was 2, would fearlessly run off crazy things into my arms and jump out of trees into my arms because he was far more affiliated with love and trust in me than he was understanding of gravity and the fear of the consequence. much of the human existence is predicated in fear, which again, from a design standpoint to ensure survivability, makes sense. But I would lean into discomfort. I'd become more aware of those areas that you are afraid to challenge or you're afraid to look. I would question everything. As a fundamental principle, I don't want anyone to believe anything I'm saying because I'm saying it. I want them to use that information to challenge themselves and to see, how could this be true? How may this be true? If anything that your listeners heard that challenged them or pissed them off, I would encourage them, instead of just to write it off, to do the work of understanding, why does this make me angry? Why does this challenge me? Why do I not want to believe this? Because you'll learn a lot about yourself. And then again, seek first to understand, then to be understood. And those are all things, and the double down on becoming more aware. Double down on becoming more aware of how you're showing up as a human. And self-awareness is the key. And I think the stat I mentioned in my book, 96% of human beings believe they are self-aware. And the last study done, it was an 8-year study, found that less than 20% of people are actually self-aware.
That's quite shocking.
Without awareness, we're like a fly hitting the window, right? This time, it's going to open, it's going to open, it's going to open. You end up the dead fly in the windowsill. There's a lot of human beings showing up to life that way because they don't know how to solve for themselves. So they're constantly solving for things outside of themselves.
Very cool. Thank you, Sebastian. I appreciate all that insight. And those are some great questions and great insights. I mean, your position, again, as a content creator, as a coach, as a mentor, as a businessman, as a marketer, really does give you quite a surprising lens into what's happening and why it's happening. So I do encourage everybody to go and check out Sebastian's channels. Sebastian's, where can we find you?
At Sebastian Angus on all major platforms. Sebastian is spelled with an A, not an E. It's a classic mistake. I don't know. I went with the A spelling, not the E spelling, but it throws people off. But all of my contents, most of my content to this point has just been repurposed for social media. I think the second half of this year, we're going to start launching a lot more camera-facing content specifically for my social media followers and the people that I connect with online. But first and foremost, most of what I teach is in front of a live audience and has been teased and tested with real people. It's not theoretical knowledge. And I think a lot of people are resonating with that right now because its focus is mostly on how to think about things and how to approach things, not what to think about things, which I think is what we need. We need people to teach people how to think more than what to think, and to live more by principle. Principles aren't perfect, but you can get a much better, stable, predictable result that moves us towards, I would say, a more stable future when we operate from principle and then be willing to upgrade our principles in light of superior principles. And so that's a lot of what I try to teach and try to impart.
That's fantastic. Well, we shall for sure be following you, Sebastian. Adam, tell us a little bit of a wise little ending to this conversation from your perspective as an attachment specialist. And,
Well,
where
sure.
can we find you?
Possibility comes through understanding what is possible. Your decisions will be shaped by what you believe is possible. If you've never seen the color red, you won't know that color red is an option when you paint your living room. You need to see the range of colors and the experiences and have them, and that's usually going to mean connecting with other humans, exploring your world, having that curiosity, and being able to make different decisions based on what you then gather and what you learn is possible. So explore possibilities is the number one thing I can possibly tell you. I am also on Instagram as @AttachmentAdam, where you can find all kinds of content, short form, static images, educational pieces, everything. It's all available there, and I'm here if you need to reach out. Andre, where can we find you?
I'm at Andrei Korkov on Instagram, and you can see what we do with content creators on veritascreative.media. Adam being one, and many others that we're helping in the space of relationships and self-help and many other areas. So come check us out, and definitely follow Sebastian for more insights, more wisdom. We appreciate the time, Sebastian. Thank you very much for coming to I Wish You Knew. It was a pleasure to have you. And everybody else, thank you for listening. Like, share, comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And we'll see you on the next episode of I Wish You Knew.